A company linked to the peer Baroness Mone and her husband Doug Barrowman has been ordered by the High Court to pay the government £122 million in damages. It's all over the supply of PPE, personal protective equipment, during the COVID pandemic. We will give you the whole backstory to this big story on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, Laura, lovely to speak to you on a Wednesday rather than listen to you on a Saturday and Sunday.
Marvellous. Well, it's very nice to be with you too.
And I should say watch you on Sunday as well. Multimedia. Right, I wonder if the best thing to do with this story, because it has dragged on for a long time, is to just go back to the start. It's 2020. The British government, like every government in the world, is desperate to get PPE, personal protective equipment. They are taking offers and tip-offs from everyone to get their hands on this stuff. And one of the tip-offs is that a company called PPE Medpro.
And one of the people who puts their hand up in private to the government in a conversation with Michael Gove, then Cabinet Minister, is Michelle Mone, Conservative peer, incredibly well-known, high-profile business person, somebody who had made her way through lots of glitz and glamour from a pretty gritty background that she was always happy to talk about, and somebody who had become her own very prominent brand. She put her hand up, said she could help. There was a consortium being led by her husband, Doug Barrowman, called PPE Medpro. And through the course of lots and lots of conversations, they did a deal. And PPE Medpro was contracted to supply gowns and masks in order to help that sort of massive call for, oh my God, doctors and nurses are literally going to run out of the equipment that they need to save people's lives in this terrible, terrible pandemic. Fast forward to a while later, PPE Medpro is suddenly in trouble because there are claims that they have not provided the right kind of gowns. Michelle Mone denies that she had anything to do with that company. And the plot from then on thickens and becomes murkier and murkier.
Yeah, so it's around the end of 2020 when the government is saying, actually, these gowns aren't suitable. And there's millions and millions and millions of them. And then the sort of the newspapers start reporting this, particularly the Guardian are digging into it. And then there's a big milestone, that you're involved in 2023, which is when Michelle Mone and Doug Barrowman do their big interview with you on the Sunday morning.
That's right. So for somebody who had spent years in the spotlight, when this story first blew up, Michelle Mone uncharacteristically essentially went dark. You know, they'd put their denials out there and they eventually just sort of shut themselves down. She took a leave from the House of Lords. She would sort of took herself out of the spotlight while all these accusations about what they'd done ran riot. You know, photographs of her in the paper all the time in her swimsuit on her husband's yacht and all these sorts of things. She was basically described and sort of set up as a pantomime villain of the pandemic through many, many, many months. But she'd never really directly responded. December 2023, after some months of conversations behind the scenes, she and Barrowman agreed to sit down and give their side of the story, speaking to us in an interview for the BBC. They admitted that they had lied about their involvement with PPE Medpro at the beginning, which was a huge admission for them to make. And also Mone admitted that she would stand to benefit from the money that Medpro had made from that deal with the Department of Health. So there were two big sort of admissions from Michelle Mone and her husband during that interview, which sort of blew up into a huge moment in the sort of history of this saga. And you know, again, we're at one of these stages, Adam. You know, one of my favorite things, two things can be true at the same time.
Oh, yes.
You know, did they make mistakes? Yes, by their own admission, absolutely. And they were vilified for them. Are they also what they strongly believe to be scapegoats for a wider, massive shambles involving billions of pounds during a national emergency? That's where they hope they might have found some sympathy with the public, because there were plenty of other people who were providing PPE in that big emergency moment. And I know that you will remember, because you remember everything like this, there was a select committee report that was hugely critical of all of the procurement that happened during that period of time when there was this sort of national scramble and lots and lots and lots and lots of mistakes were made.
And I mean, there was always a political element to this in multiple dimensions, wasn't there? Because there was the original setup of the so-called VIP lane where people with connections to the government and the Conservative Party got sort of quicker access to the process for the procurement. Then there was the fact that Michelle Mone had been appointed as a Conservative peer in the House of Lords by David Cameron quite earlier on in his prime ministership. And then there's the fact that in the build-up to the general election in 2024, Labour campaigned on all of this stuff and said, oh, we're going to investigate it. We're going to appoint a commissioner who will go even deeper into what went on. So there was always a lot of politics around this story.
That's right. Inevitably there were. And it got wrapped in a sense with that sense that the Conservative government had not always played fair during the pandemic, that there'd been one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. And I think whether that's sort of, Partygate or people who were friends with Conservative ministers being able to make money out of the pandemic, I think it did all get wrapped up into this sort of toxic ball of horror. We had Angela Rayner actually in particular, all the time talking about Tory corruption and Tory sleaze and anything involving deals for their mates and all those sorts of things. It's worth saying, actually, when this eventually did come out about the Mones, the Conservatives, of course, were still in power at that point. And the court case began under a Conservative administration. But you're right. I mean, it's sort of politically toxic. And, the mixture of politics and money is always toxic. And the VIP lane, to people like Transparency International, the campaigning group who put a press release out about it this afternoon, this notion of the VIP lane was always, I think, almost sort of offensive to some people. If you are a very important person, you might have preferred access to be able to sell things to the government. Now, the other way of looking at that is, look, this was a national emergency. If there were people who could help, who had contacts, of course you would want to put them to the front of the queue because this was an emergency, and the quicker you can do these things and cut out the kind of normal procurement deals, which might have taken months to get through the system, that was the genesis of it. But it was very, very messy, very, very murky. And for Michelle Mone, who was somebody who had created a personal brand, and I don't say that I know that's sort of nausea to talk about people's personal brands, but I think in this case, it's fair to say she was a brand, and she was incredibly successful at attracting attention for all the right reasons. And then, of course, when things went wrong, she was then incredibly successful at attracting attention for all the wrong reasons. And that, in a way, I think, look, it's been a sort of financial disaster, but also a sort of personal disaster, I think, for her, somebody who was so proud of her reputation and what she had achieved. And I think you can tell her and her husband put out a very strongly worded release this afternoon after the result of the court case about how they believe this was an establishment stitch-up. It's been a cover-up, that the government is too big to fail, because having sat down with them for a couple of hours, I suppose it's nearly 2 years ago now, I think they believe very strongly that apart from not getting their story straight in the first place, I think they believe very strongly that really they didn't do anything wrong. And for lots of newscasters and people who watched the interview at that time, that was probably very hard to believe. But I do think they believed that. I really do.
But also what's interesting is when you read the summary of the judgment from the High Court today, none of that comes into the legal process that the judge was engaged in today. The judgment is all just about what did the contract say, and specifically, what did the contract say about PPE Medpro proving to the government that the gowns they were providing had been sanitised to the correct international, European and British standard? Actually, the judgment is a very narrow thing about contracts and the law around contracts.
Well, that's right. And that's all it ever was, to be honest. The question was, had they supplied what they said they were going to supply to the standard that they supplied them to? Now, Medpro always said, yes, we absolutely did. Suggestion was the government found out they'd ordered far too much, felt like a bit of a wally, went back and tried to see who they could basically retrospectively unpick the contract with to see if they could get any cash back, which is a much less glamorous way of thinking about this story than a sort of Herculean battle between a multi-millionaire and the government during a national emergency. What Medpro have also said today, or what Doug Barrowman has said today, is that the Department of Health fought the court case in a different way than they had expected them to in pre-trial conversations. But as you say, it comes down to two different versions of events, right? So Medpro always said, look, we had special permission because it was an emergency to check the gowns in a way that might not normally have weighed. And if you really want, we can start talking about derogations. Oh, it's just like Brexit cast.
Oh, yes.
Essentially, like, could you get round in an emergency? Could you do things in a slightly different way and not cut corners, but essentially expedite things because it was an emergency? Medpro basically said all the way through, look, we had permission to do that. Everybody knew what was happening. The DH then screwed up at the other end. The court case, and obviously I'm wildly oversimplifying here. The DH said, no, Medpro basically didn't do things in the right place and it's their fault. And it's a really, as you say, it's strange because ultimately the reasoning of the ruling sounds quite dry and technical, but actually this is this huge story and this huge story about politics and money and everybody's agony during the pandemic and people trying to shift blame around. But the actual ruling is very, very technical. Whether they'll appeal, as we speak at about 3:30 on Wednesday afternoon, I think that's still an open question because they certainly felt, or my understanding was they felt going into this case, they felt actually that they were pretty solid. But let's see.
And also there was one bit where the Department of Health lost because they were also claiming £8 million to pay for the storage costs of all these unused gowns. And the court said, no, you're not winning on that because actually you haven't done the case in the right amount of time and in the right way. So it wasn't a complete victory for the government. Also, there's this issue that PPE Medpro yesterday went into administration. So actually, there's a chance that there won't be a company with any resources there that could even pay these damages.
That's also true. And therefore, what does the government do then? So what does the government's loud proclamations that they're going to go and get all this money, what does that actually come to in the end? Possibly nothing. Who knows? And what also has happened to the government's wider promised efforts to go after lots of other people here too? The government even appointed something like, and correct me, you'll remember the acronym probably, the COVID Anti-Corruption Commissioner or something like that was appointed nearly a year ago. Have they been able to get back any cash? Have they been able to find any other mistakes? I'm not so sure. And we know, as MPs looked at it, that there were billions and billions of pounds worth of procurement mess ups, according to a group of MPs. Actually, Medpro is only one of the things that went wrong. And that essentially always, that goes to the heart of what Mone and Barrowman have always argued is lots of people made huge mistakes. They feel they were unfairly targeted because of her profile. She was sort of too tempting a target for the Department of Health not to go after. And they had very strong views about how they really believed that they were sort of politically targeted. But whether or not there's truth in that is a different question. We've talked about it so many times, haven't we? I mean, even years ago when we were reporting on the pandemic as it was unfolding, it was clear at some moments how chaotic things were inside government. I think it will be really interesting to see if this government, who's sort of promised again today to go after all the people and get all the money back, is that really something that's viable? I just think we don't know the answer to that question, but it certainly puts all of this back in the public's eye again. And, don't forget the COVID inquiry is still running. And of course, it all has a different political heat because the politicians in charge have all left the stage in one way or another. But it still matters to people. God, and they think what happened to people's lives during the pandemic. This stuff all matters because it's such a huge part of our national story. Although she and her husband still clearly from their statements to the press today believe that they have very much been victimised in this, notwithstanding the fact that in our interview in December 23, they did admit to having got some things very wrong.
And so we've done the political track, the journalistic track, the legal track, and then in terms of the criminal track, there is a criminal investigation into PPE Medpro being done by the National Crime Agency, but no charges have been brought.
I mean, the way they see it, there was a call to arms, to use Michelle Mone's phrase. There was an opportunity for them to help the country by being able to provide PPE, but also to make money, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. The story blew up. They denied getting involved. But as she said, it's not a crime to lie. But they lied about their involvement to the press. They don't think that they've done anything criminal. I think we'll have to see in the fullness of time whether anything happens. In terms of the NCA investigation, because there's been this other track of this court case playing out between the Department of Health and Medpro, who knows? It's possible that the NCA investigation will suddenly either conclude or suddenly come up with something in public, because one sort of leg of this whole thing has been out of the way. But it's also possible that they might appeal, in which case, who knows, it all gets drawn out for an even longer period of time.
Well, Laura, it's been great to catch up with you, and thanks for all your hard work on this story for, multiple years now.
Goodness me. Well, thank you. It's nice to be with newscasters in the middle of the week. It's like a mini break.